Hello, welcome to the second part of the discussion on Indian theatre. In the first part, I spoke about Indian classical theatre belonging to the ancient period. Today, I am going to talk about folk theatre. Now, the primary issue with folk theatre is that one cannot really formulate a set of laws or a set of structured patterns for folk, because folk is very local. Folk is related to the original geographical space. Folk dominates and is dominated by its source, both spatially, temporally, and narrative wise. And folk narrative, just like folk theatre, just like folk narrative or folk songs, defy the high cultural affinity for rules. They are much more relaxed, they are much more closer to the ground, they are much more relatable, at least to the people from whom they originate. So that is why the idea of the folk. And we know folk is something that is essentially bothered with or concerned with local legends, local history, art, local art, and local stories. So very regional in that particular sense of the term, and it has its regional identity stamped on it. That is one of the things that makes it quite special, in fact. And what is even more special is that even though I say it is quite regional, still there are certain elements which bind them together, all the different folk patterns, folk elements from different spaces, even different countries, even different continents, different civilizations. So that is one of the most wonderful things about folk. And of course, mythology has a very strong role to play. Mythology, as we know, also has very localized origins, which sometimes after ages they become somewhat more universal, but at source they're quite local. And so when we come to folk theatre, it is the same thing, because folk theatre on the one hand caters to religious needs, and on the other caters to social needs. So essentially one can divide folk theatre into two broad parts, one being religious, the other one being secular. Secular, or sometimes one might even call it social. So these are the two major divisions based on the primary theme of the theatrical narrative that is being presented through performance. So that is there. And if you remember, I said that for a long time the high cultural Sanskrit literature, Sanskrit drama ruled. Then for certain historical reasons there was a decline. Now some people say that this is the time when folk theatre emerged as a major presence in the history of art. I sometimes wonder whether that is quite true. What is true is that yes, folk theatre was overshadowed by the more dominant, more aristocratic, more a courtly kind of Sanskrit theatre. But that does not mean that there was no folk theatre. Folk theatre was always there. In the past, they were not recorded, they were not considered to be worthy of recording, perhaps by the higher powers. So there is no proper history of folk. In recent times, after a lot of Western, European and Indian and Asiatic and African thinkers looked at history of folk and looked at the continuous journey of folk, that we have this kind of fascination, we have this serious discussion as far as folk is concerned. But for a long time, folk was not really thought worthy of a lot of consideration. But anyway, but folk was there. The point being, folk was very much there in the lives of the people who could not be a part of the high cultural, aristocratic, courtly theatre. How did they entertain themselves? Folk was always there through folk songs, folk tales, folk histories, folk legends, and these all came together as folk performances. Even though folk had a much looser structure and had a much more relaxed kind of an approach to words, action and music, still folk managed to become this dominant kind of a theatrical form for quite a while, in fact, and it was the absence of this very concrete kind of codification, which did not allow people a lot of leeway, created a space that is completely artificial. The audience knew what it was witnessing was high art, and the audience had to be familiar with everything that is artistic. The audience was dealing with this high art thing, everything that was, well, artificial in movement, in language, in gestures. Everything was formalized. Everything had a formula that had to be followed. So that much is there. But when we come to folk, what folk did was it presented emotion at its rawest. It presented the responses of the people to life, to law, to living, to contemporary politics. It allowed them this free expression, and it all worked through ritualized tradition. And this is a different kind of a tradition that we are looking at. This is a different kind of a ritual that we are looking at. So this is folk ritual. The sphere is entirely different. And this allows a kind of familiarity. The stage space is not a separate, unfamiliar, codified kind of a space. But the stage space is something that is just an extension of life, of the space that the audience is living in. So that way, this whole performance was closer to the audience's mind. So that is still one of the most valuable elements that folk has. This is something that allows folk to win over many other such elements. And you know, when Sanskrit drama had its decline, there was a fear that the entire process of preserving tradition We are speaking about a time when these performances had the responsibility of preserving a lot of history, a lot of ancient stories, a lot of cultural markers. And folk had automatically inherited this. And so folk now became a career, a preserver. It was the form within which tradition, culture not only found a kind of reawakening, but also found survival, because a lot of new traditions were coming in, a lot of new influences were coming in. The older traditions were in danger, and folk somehow held on to that, and quite often folk became this witness to the happy amalgamation of the old and the new. Folk often became the witness to the passage of time, of the evolution of culture, how new cultural spaces opened up. So folk would look at all that when new deities were coming in. In Bengal, the Mongol Kabbos would do something like that. Manosha Mongol would speak of how Manosha, the goddess, the new goddess, found worship, found acceptance amongst the people. So that's a wonderful area that one may look at. Manosha Mongol Kabbo might have a very different space in literary history, but the folk origin of the tale and the folk performances that must have been there quite often, they would speak of these new influences coming in somehow or the other. It's not always from an antithetical source or a contrasting kind of a source, but even within the ongoing culture, even within the primary culture, there are subcultures which rise, subcultures which fall. So folk often became a repository of all that. Folk then was telling the stories from mythologies, stories from history, stories from epics, stories from the Puranas, and they were all disseminated through folk art forms, through folk theatre. And since storytelling was such a major influence, folk was introducing the narrator figure, who was often called the Shutradhar, someone who would be the narrator, commentator. So along with narration, the Shutradhar would also have the responsibility of commenting on the action. So this was another way that folk could go closer to the people, that someone who is introducing, perhaps explaining, linking one act with the other, one scene with the other. So that kind of a relationship was quite informal. It was almost outside the performance space, a kind of a negotiator between the two spaces, reality and the stage space. So which was quite wonderful, in fact. And it survived. We have so many instances where such narrator figures come into play. So that was there, and the story was performed. So this is one thing that a lot of folk theatres have, that they are claiming to be stories performed. They no longer are theatre in its most sophisticated, codified, rigidified term, but stories being told through performance. And this is fantastic because it allows a different layer of complexity when we approach it through narrative theory, when we approach it through theatre theory. The language of theatre changes a little. It becomes a different language. Of course, when we talk about puppet theatre, when we talk about street theatre, the entire language changes. So folk theatre manages to have an independent language on its own. So let me come to different folk theatres that we have in India. We have so many. I mean, one can think of Tamasha in Maharashtra, one can think of Jatra in West Bengal, one can think of Nautanki in the central part of India. So there are so many forms, but see, all these forms have these strikingly similar elements, like they would not need a dedicated stage. They can have an elevated space, they can have a dedicated stage, but they don't need it. They can function equally well in the open spaces. They can, they can do without the props that we are habituated to. They depend much more on physical acting, they depend much more on dialogue, and often physicality of the physical responses to the crowd quite often. So those things, they have these individual stylistic patterns, but they still manage to have these elements common. Wherever you go in India, the folk would have such freedom, such liberties. Along with these liberties, there are certain issues which are often quite common. For instance, there are often invocations. Now, the invocation is to the relevant deity. It's not always to one of the Hindu trinities or one of the significant local deities, but it can be any deity, it can be any other god belonging to any other religion. It depends entirely on the locality, but often this invocation is a part of it, especially if what we are looking at is a religious kind of a thing. Whether religious or secular, quite often the folk elements will have the jester figure, and the jester figure, the Vidushaka figure, which we have in high drama as well, but in folk they would have a different kind of role to play. And the performances, of course, have a much greater license, and the carnivalesque element often becomes very, very necessary, very, very present. The invocation will often depend also on the occasion, because folk performances are often occasion specific. These theatres would be played during certain festivals, and they would be very specific to that festival. They would not be performed in another time. For instance, if we are looking at the New Harvest festivals, so there would be certain specific plays. Just like in the West there are the maypole dances during the New Harvest, during the spring festivals. So the spring festivals would have one kind of one set of performances, the autumn festivals would have another set of performances, so on and so forth. But the other elements that would be there is the presence of a comic figure, the jester. That becomes a very necessary presence, like the Vidushaka figure. In West Bengal, in Bengal, the figure is often called the Bhaar, the low-brow, loud kind of comic presence. And sometimes there are issues like cross-dressing, and these cross-dressing issues often challenge typical gender stereotypes. But anyway, that is a part of folk which allows a lot of dissension, because one of the major elements in all folk is dissent. Through the carnivalesque, often certain challenges to the dominant powers are presented, and folk manages to speak about local concerns. Folk manages to speak about these oppressions that are present on a very local regional level. So folk often tries to speak against them and create awareness, create this dissent. So that is also a major fact of folk. Now I will talk about, as I said, a few folk performances that we find in India very briefly. I'm not going to drag this out for a long time. There are hundreds of different folk performances one can find. And I am not even talking about the dance drama forms, the forms in which the dance patterns, which of course are quite often appropriated by high culture. Something like Kuchipudi, something like Kathakali would be dance performance forms which are no longer on the realm of folk as such, because they are now appropriated by high culture. But something like Chhau from West Bengal would be typically folk, and they would have ritualized performances based on Ramayana, based on the epics and the mythologies. I am sure you know about Chhau, which is a masked performance. And this is the other thing, a lot of folk theatre would have these elements which would separate them, which would identify them regionally, as well as they would identify them formally. So that is another wonderful thing. But the first form that I wanted to talk about was from the Satnami thing, the Nacha form. This is particularly interesting to me because Habib Tanveer, the great Indian theatrician, was experimenting with this particular form, and particularly if you look at a play like Charandas Chor, which is kind of adopting the folk elements, and we see how the Chhattisgarhi Satnami sect and their Panthi dancing, Panthi performances are becoming very important here. And it's not a very old form. It began with Guru Ghasidas, who was present, not very, it's not an ancient kind of sect. It's not as old as other tribal forms present in Chhattisgarh and in neighboring states and in India. But it is talking about the sectarian ideas, it is talking about the sectarian moralities, it is presenting the plight of the people and how this particular sect is giving them a kind of a spiritual solace, assistance. But even within such a religious framework, there is this idea of resistance. There is this voice against the class-based hierarchy, which often becomes tremendously oppressive. So that becomes a very significant issue. And the Panthi dance, which happens in this festival basically happens around late winter, and they speak about local issues, they speak about moral issues, and the influence of other tribal forms, particularly Nachat is the main form in Chhattisgarh, I guess. Even though the emphasis is on the religious, the secular ideas are not lost, but primarily because they do not forget that there has to be an entertainment value. There has to be this connection, and that is one of the major ideas, because the stories are originating from the region, and the region, the stories, culture itself can never be free of politics. So this is a very important idea, and when you look at these Chhattisgarhi practices, you will see that these become representatives of this amalgamation of the religious and the secular, this coexistence of the religious and the secular. And the reason I mention this in particular, because as I said, this is not a very old form, this is a relatively young form, but it goes on to show how new folk forms emerge, how along with the old folk forms, there is always space for the new to begin, to exist. The old will not keep on resisting, the old will not stifle, kind of drown the new because it wants to be powerful. That is the brilliance of folk. It can coexist. And this is once again seen in performances like Shumang Leela, which is from Manipur. Shumang means an open space, and Leela means performance. So this Shumang Leela automatically means performance in an open space, and this evolved from the Manipuri clown dances, which are called Phagi, and they are different from what they call Pampak Leela, which are the stage plays. Now, Shumang Leela, this clown play, as I mentioned, was something that began as very rudimentary kinds of performances. It was not something that was structured. Even the folk theatre structure was not there. These were smaller comic performances, like farces perhaps, and eventually they created this theatre out of it, because what we have here is the presence of the audience, which is sitting all around. There would be one small path which would allow the actors to go up to the space, which would be open on all sides, and the performance would be in the center, and the people would be sitting all around. So this would be a very inclusive kind of a performance. The actors not having the comfort of a direction in which they are not being witnessed, a direction which is not allowing them some sort of retreat, let's say. So they have to be there in full view, and they cannot retreat because there are no wings. So it's a very different kind of a performance. And some people sometimes try to find parallels with the Jatra form, which is there in Bengal, which is there in Assam, and in some forms. And because Jatra also is Jatra stage, the Jatra performance space is open on three sides. Jatra usually has a stage because the way Jatra is presented, they need an elevated space. So that is basically it. It's not the kind of a picture frame stage that we imagine with all kinds of props or all that. But I will come back to Jatra soon enough. But what is the reason I am talking about Shumang Leela is that it has this, or at least it used to have this specific kind of a norm, because at one point of time there would be all male troops and all female troops. This gender divide is quite peculiar, or let me not call it peculiar, let me call it unusual. And this gender divide, and what is very interesting is that in the troops in which there will be all male players, the men will play the roles of women, and in the all female troops, the women would play the roles of men. The other genders may find inclusivity now, I hope. But anyway, in folk forms, they are often, in fact, concerned with certain such ideas which are emerging, as I said. So, keeping that in mind, there might be such issues coming up, if not already there, and it's high time that gender issues are addressed in all spheres of art. They are, definitely, but more and more so, hopefully, in the coming years, because we should ask for individual liberty more than anything else. The only freedom that works is the freedom to choose. But anyway, let me not become too dialectical and too much like that. But coming back to Shumang Leela, this whole, and what is curious is that this all male troops are sometimes more popular with this extra popularity found by the male players who play female roles. Somehow, some people have recorded that these troops, these actors are more popular. I don't know why, but this is definitely worth talking about. And Shumang Leela, in fact, is very significant in the history of theatre in Manipur, because it was around 100 years back that we have these performances. We have a play called Harishchandra, I think, which becomes the first proper play Before that, there were a lot of performances, but as critics record, that these performances were essentially borrowed performances from other neighboring regions. But with this particular play, and with Shumang Leela and Phampham Leela, the idea of a Manipuri theatre proper is beginning. And what happened was, Harishchandra, and I think there is a play called Narasingha, which is very important in the history of Manipuri theatre. I'm sorry, I should have been more specific. I should be more specific, but I guess you can always find out. So the smaller plays, the clown plays that I mentioned, that slowly developed, and they began to come into the mainstream. And this is the other interesting evolution from folk to the mainstream. And in fact, what happened was, these clown plays were essentially constructed to generate laughter. Whereas by the middle of the 20th century, towards the beginning of the 20th century, we have these theatres. At least we have records of these theatres. And then this is slowly becoming more and more structured, and in fact it's around 1950 that these plays are having fixed scripts. And this is significant because before that the scripts were changeable. So they were changed, they were altered, they did not have the dictatorship of the scripted play text. But that is beginning. So that is a major point in the history of such theatre. There would be, of course, other performance, and this is something that I would request you to remember always, that if I am talking about Shumang Leela, it's not like the clown plays have stopped entirely. It's like what we deal with in history of literature. When Sanskrit theatre is happening, folk theatre is not happening. It's not like that. They are happening simultaneously. They are surviving. After Shakespeare, during the Restoration, it's not only the Restoration comedies, but Shakespeare is being revived all the time. So they all exist. Something new does not mean always that the old is discarded. They often exist together. Now let me come to the idea of the Jatra. Jatra, in fact, began from the usual folk dance, folk art, folk tales, folk songs, and in Bengal there were issues. There were forms like Kobil Lorai, where two poets would be fighting with each other, and they would not always be quite parliamentary. They would often be quite problematic in language, in attitude. They would be vicious, in fact. But all that existed for a very long time, even though they did not often have the stamp of approval from the so-called high cultural spaces. But they existed, and from mythologies, etc., Jatra began. Some people think that Jatra, which signifies a journey, the Jatra thing came from the idea of Sri Krishna's journey from Vrindavan to Mathura. So from that myth, the entire structure of this performance began. And Jatra, in fact, also spoke about Sri Chaitanya's journey. And because it was a tale of a journey, the idea of Jatra was there, and also its fascinating because Jatra troops are always moving from one. They are traveling teams. They do not stay. They might have a headquarter in Kolkata, but they move around from one space to another, performing in different villages, different festivals. And Jatra, of course, happens with the onset of autumn. From the autumn festival, Durga Pujo, Navratri perhaps, they begin and they happen until harvest in February, March. So that is the time, because of course the weather has to be good, because it's an open space thing. Like in all folk theatres, weather and the seasons become very important in Jatra. Now, as I said, Sri Chaitanya's return from Mathura was another set of narratives that was a part of Jatra for a long time. It was mythological essentially. And what is very interesting is that although opera is definitely very high culture, but Jatra often has this operatic kind of a response with its high pitched acting, songs which are very, well, since I cannot think of a better expression, loud. So, and interestingly, a lot of Jatra troupes are called operas. There are so many, operas like Bharat Ratna opera and Anandalok opera. So these they would be Jatra teams, Jatra troupes. So they would be calling themselves opera. This perhaps is a very palpable Western influence. And although it does not really have any significance as far as the form is concerned, the form is full of high drama to the point of melodrama, and the figures would be larger than life, the entrances would be grand, they would be absolutely breathtaking, and they would be full of very striking, loud dialogue. The music would be loud, the music would correspond with the dialogues, they would interact, and it would be a kind of this attack on your senses. Through sound, through visuals, the costumes would be very loud, very colorful. I mean, you will find all the colors of the rainbow on the stage. That is the Jatra stage. And it's fascinating that they are like that. And initially these plays were talking about epics, these plays were talking about mythology. But after a while, around 20th century, social issues creeped in. The idea of resistance was there through the religious plays, which are called palas. Pala might be a kind of a very broken down version of the word play. So the influence of Western culture on Jatra is apparent on many levels. But Jatra became quite social with somebody called Gopal Pure, who was creating Jatra in early 19th century, but it kind of evolved into something completely social around the beginning of the 20th century, or perhaps a little earlier. Of course, what is also very significant is that this idea of resistance that I keep talking about, that was apparent because in these Jatras there was a lot of Swadeshi flavor, and Jatras were utilized by the Swadeshi movement to create this kind of atmosphere of resistance among people. this is what folk performance can do. High, serious political discourse cannot often create the effect that a simple folk performance can. One cannot be sure how long that effect would last, but it would definitely create an effect. And during this whole Swadeshi thing, the villains would be the colonizers, and like indigo plantations, that whole story about how people were made to cultivate indigo at the cost of other crops, and that created a lot of economic difficulty for a lot of people. So these would be parts and parcel and things like that. Things which are closer to the ground would be very important in these palas. So they would have this flavor in which the resistance is there, in which mythology is there, but they would also have a lot of humor. This humor would be coarse, this humor would be loud along with everything else, but they would have that flavor because, like all other folk performances, Jatra also understands that a play full of seriousness often does not work. People need comic relief, and these elements of comic relief would be parallel in tenor and tone with the rest of the play, and they would be very loud. And the one thing that is very interesting in Jatra is the Vivek jury system. Vivek is in most, not now perhaps, not as dominant, that practice is not dominant right now as much as it was at one point of time. But the person who is playing the Vivek would be, as Vivek signifies, the conscience, who will flit in and out, who will be the voice of conscience, who will be commenting. So that person would be within and without the performance space. That person would be like the Shutrudhar perhaps, who would be commenting on whatever is happening, but from a superior stance. That person's stance would be the morally high, grounded stance. So that is interesting. And the jury thing are the musicians who would be performing live. And they are also outside the performance space, but they are responding to it. Often there would be interactions between the Vivek and the jury. That interaction would be a very interesting thing to see. And they also would sometimes become narrators. The Vivek figure may not always be there, but the jury is mostly there. And someone like Utpal Datta believed in this Vivek jury thing, but that is post-independence, that is where we reach the time of IPTA, and something that I will be talking about in the next and final discussion. And the Vivek is a later addition. Jury was already there. Music is necessary in all folk performances in some form or the other. The jury is a more sophisticated kind of a system because there would be 3 or 4 musicians playing 3 or 4 separate instruments and creating a musical background. I will end today's discussion. There are plenty of other folk forms in India which demand attention, but I will end it today by saying that Jatra is something that is completely commercial. Jatra has this is very special because the complete commercialization of the Jatra form happened long time back, a long time back. And what Jatra has done in the neighboring Orissa, in Assam, in all parts where Jatra is relevant, that it has adopted new technology. It has now borrowed a flashy lighting, special effects, musical advancements, projections, etc. Because what they need to do is to create an entertainment package. Jatra also is very much dependent on the star system. Famous stars from films often perform in Jatra. They would perform perhaps for 5 minutes. There are people who would be the heroes of the Jatra, but there would be some who would be appearing for 5 minutes, and people would actually flock to see them live in person. So Jatra is a very commercial thing, and this is where the folk and the idea of its commercial viability come together, because folk is not always limited to a non-commercial, a ritualistic or a religious kind of a thing. There is this strong element of commerciality, if one may say so, of folk. Now, I will end somewhat abruptly, but let me end here. Thank you once again for listening to me patiently. I will see you in the next lecture.